The CIA's interest in the areas of student and labor matters, cultural affairs, and community development reached a peak in the mid-1960s. By 1967, when public disclosure of NSA's funding and the subsequent report of the Katzenbach Committee caused a major curtailment of these activities, interest in the major covert action efforts in these areas was already waning. There appeared to be two reasons for this. First, there was considerable skepticism within the CIA as to the effectiveness of this approach. It differed from classical CIA, quote, tradecraft, end quote, in that the organizations funded were basically independent from CIA control. Richard Helms expressed this skepticism when he remarked in testimony before this committee. The clandestine operator is trained to believe that you really can't count on the honesty of your agent to do exactly what you want, or to report accurately unless you own him, body and soul. Footnote 2a. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 2a. Richard Helms' testimony. September 12th, 75, pages 25 to 26. Resuming the reading. Mr. Helms contended that, quote, the clandestine operator sneered at the other kind of operation, end quote, the aiding and abetting of people or organizations who are your, quote, friends, end quote, or, quote, have the same point of view that you do, end quote. Skepticism of the clandestine operators was directed particularly at the Covert Action Staff / International Organizations Division, the CIA units which conducted the programs in the area of student and cultural exchange. Second, it became increasingly difficult to conceal the CIA funds that supported these activities as the scale of the operations grew. By fiscal year 1967, for example, over $3 million was budgeted for youth and student programs and $6 million for labor. Most of the funds were transmitted through legitimate or, quote, devised, end quote, foundations, that is, fictitious entities established by the CIA. Section 1. CIA use of private foundations. Pre-1967. The use of philanthropic organizations was a convenient way to pass funds in that large amounts could be transferred rapidly and in a form that need not alert unwitting officers of the recipient organizations to their source. In addition, foundation grants bestowed upon the recipient the apparent, quote, blessing, end quote, of the foundation. The funding pattern involved a mixture of bona fide charitable foundations, devised foundations, and funds, quote, frontmen, end quote, drawn from a list of America's most prominent citizens and lawyers representing undisclosed clients. The CIA's intrusion into the foundation field in the 1960s can only be described as massive. Excluding grants from the, quote, Big Three, end quote, Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, of the 700 grants over $10,000 given by 164 other foundations during the period 1963 to 1966, at least 108 involved partial or complete CIA funding. More importantly, CIA funding was involved in nearly half the grants the non-quote Big Three, end quote, foundations made during this period in the field of international activities. In the same period, more than one-third of the grants awarded by non-quote Big Three, end quote, in the physical, life, and social sciences also involved the CIA funds. End of page 185, beginning page 186. Bona fide foundations, rather than those controlled by the CIA, were considered the best and most plausible kind of funding cover for certain kinds of operations. A 1966 CIA study explained the use of legitimate foundations was the most effective way of concealing the CIA's hand, as well as reassuring members of funded organizations that the organization was in fact supported by private funds. The agency studied contended that this technique was, quote, particularly effective for democratically run membership organizations, which needed to assure their own unwitting members and collaborators, as well as their hostile critics, that they had genuine, respectable private sources of income, end quote. Section 2. The CIA's foundation-funded covert activity, pre-1967. The philanthropic fronts used prior to 1967 funded a seemingly limitless range of covert action programs affecting youth groups, labor unions, universities, publishing houses, and other private institutions in the United States and abroad. The following list illustrates the diversity of these operations. 1. The CIA assisted in the establishment in 1951 and the funding for over a decade of research institute at a major American university. This assistance came as the result of a request from Undersecretary of State James Webb to the General Bedell Smith, then director of the CIA. Mr. Webb proposed that the center, which was to research worldwide political, economic, and social changes, be supported by the CIA in the interest of the entire intelligence community. 2. The project was undertaken in collaboration with a nationally prominent American business association. The object of the project was to promote a favorable image of America in foreign country unfavorably disposed to America, and to promote citizen-to-citizen contacts between Americans and influential segments of that country's society. Footnote 3. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 3. For explanation of italics, see footnote, page 179. Resuming the reading. 3. The cooperation of an American labor organization in selected overseas labor activities. 4. Support of an international organization of veterans and an international foundation for developing countries. 5. Support of an organization of journalists and an international women's association. 6. Partial support for an international educational exchange program run by a group of United States universities. 7. Funding of a legitimate U.S. Association of Farm Organizations. Agency funds were used to host foreign visitors, provide scholarships to an international cooperative training center at a United States university, and to reimburse the organization for various of its activities abroad. A CIA document prepared in 1967 notes that although the organization received some overt government funds from AID, the CIA should continue its covert funding because, quote, programs funded by AID cannot address themselves to the same political goals toward which agency operations are targeted, because AID programs are part of official government-to-government programs and are designed for economic, not political, results, end quote. End of page 186, beginning page 187. The best known case, covert funding of the National Student Association. CIA funding of the National Student Association, NSA, from 1952 to 1967 is a particularly good example of how the United States government entered the field of covertly supporting, quote, friends, end quote, of the vulnerabilities felt by the CIA in undertaking to support organizations and individuals that cannot be controlled, and of the operational temptation to move from support to, quote, control, end quote. The reason the CIA decided to help NSA is clear. In the years immediately after World War II, the Soviet Union took the lead in trying to organize and propagandize the world student movement. The first Soviet vice president of the International Union of Students, for example, was Alexander N. Shelepin, who later became chairman of the Soviet State Security Committee, KGB. The American students who sought to compete with these communist-managed and directed student group were hampered by a lack of funds, while the communist groups had enough money to put on world youth festivals, conferences, and forums, and regional conferences. In seeking funds at home, the American students found they were considered too far to the left in the general climate of McCarthyism and anti-intellectualism of the 1950s. Against this background, NSA officials, after being refused by the State Department and rebuffed by Congress, were finally directed by the State Department in 1952 to the CIA. Footnote 4. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 4. Under the agreed arrangement, CIA funds would support only the international division of the National Student Association. Only the NSA president and the International Affairs vice president would be witting of the CIA connection. Each year, after the election of new student leaders, the CIA held a secret briefing for the new officers and elicited from them a secrecy agreement. During the 1960s, however, witting National Student Association leaders became increasingly restive about the CIA sponsorship until finally, in 1967, one of them revealed the relationship to Ramparts magazine. Resuming the reading. The CIA maintains that its funding efforts were based on shared interests, not on manipulation. CIA funding of the National Student Association appears to have been intended primarily to permit United States students to represent their own ideas in their own way in the international forums of the day. Nevertheless, the committee has found instances in which the CIA moved from blank check support to operational use of individual students. Footnote 5. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 5. Quote, operational use, end quote, of individuals as used in this report means recruitment, use, or training on either a witting or unwitting basis for intelligence purposes. That is, the individual is directed or, quote, tasked, end quote, to do something for the CIA, as opposed to volunteering information. Such purposes include covert action, clandestine intelligence collection, espionage, and various kinds of support functions. Resuming the reading. For example, over 250 U.S. students were sponsored by the CIA to attend youth festivals in Moscow, Vienna, and Helsinki, and were used for missions such as reporting on Soviet and Third World personalities or observing Soviet security practices. A United States student, for example, was recruited in 1957 to serve as a CIA, quote, asset, end quote, at the 6th World Youth Festival in Moscow. According to CIA documents, he was instructed to report on Soviet counterintelligence measures and to purchase a piece of Soviet-manufactured equipment. End of page 187, beginning page 188. Although the CIA's involvement with the National Student Association was limited to the organization's international activities, CIA influences was felt to some extent in its domestic programs as well. The most direct way in which such influence may have been felt was in the selection process for NSA officers. The summer international seminars conducted for NSA leaders and potential leaders in the United States during the 1950s and 1960s were a vehicle for the agency to identify new leaders and to promote their candidacy for elective positions in the National Student Association. The Central Intelligence Agency's experience with the NSA underlines the basic problem of an action-oriented clandestine organization entering into a covert funding relationship with private organizations. Support of friends turns into the control of their actions and ultimately to creation of new, quote, friends, end quote. Section 3. Cover is blown. The Patman and Rampart's, quote, flaps, end quote. In a public hearing in 1964, Congressman Wright Patman, chairman of the Subcommittee on Foundations of the House Committee on Problems of Small Businesses, revealed the names of eight of the CIA's funding instruments, the so-called, quote, Patman 8, end quote. These disclosures sharply jarred the agency's confidence in the security of these philanthropic funding mechanisms. The Patman disclosures led the CIA to take a hard look at this technique of funding, but not to reconsider the propriety of bringing the independence of America's foundations into question by using them as conduits for the funding of covert action projects. According to the chief of the Covert Action Staff's Program and Evaluation Group, the real lesson of the Patman flap is not that we need to get out of the business of using foundation cover for funding, but that we need to get at it more professionally and extensively. Despite the best efforts of the agency throughout 1966 to shore up its vulnerable mechanisms, it became increasingly clear that Rampart's magazine, the New York Times, and the Washington Post were moving ever closer to unraveling not only the CIA system of clandestine funding, but to exposing the source of the support for the National Student Association. In an effort to determine whether there was foreign influence on funds behind the Ramparts expose, the CIA, in coordination with the FBI, undertook, through its own counterintelligence staff, to prepare extensive reports on the Ramparts officers and staff members. Footnote 6. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 6. The agency appointed a special assistant to the deputy director for plans who was charged with, quote, pulling together information on Ramparts, including any evidence of subversion, in brackets, and end brackets, devising proposals for counteraction, end quote. In pursuing the, quote, communist ties, end quote, of Ramparts magazine, the, quote, case, end quote, of managing editor Robert Scheer was one of the first to be developed, and a report was sent on Scheer to to Walt W. Rostow, special assistant to President Johnson. Resuming the reading. At a press briefing on February 14th, 1967, the State Department publicly confirmed a statement by leaders of NSA that their organization had received covert support from the CIA since the early 1950s. The National Student Association statement and disclosures in Ramparts magazine brought on a storm of public and congressional criticism. In response, President, end of page 188, beginning page 189, Johnson organized a committee composed of Undersecretary of State Nicholas Katzenbach, Secretary of HEW John Gardner, and CIA Director Richard Helms, to review government activities that may, quote, endanger the integrity and independence of educational community, end quote. The committee's life was short, 43 days, but its recommendations, accepted by President Johnson on March 29, 1967, were to have a profound effect on the CIA's clandestine operations, both in the United States and abroad. Section 4. The Katzenbach Committee. President Johnson's concern for the integrity and independence of American institutions could have resulted in the Katzenbach Committee being charged with general review of the domestic impact of clandestine activities and their effect on American institutions, including consideration of whether all covert relationships should be prohibited, and if not, what guidelines should be imposed on the use of institutions and individuals. Instead, the Johnson administration carefully and consciously limited the mandate of the Katzenbach Committee's investigation to the relationship between the CIA and, quote, U.S. educational and private voluntary organizations which operate abroad, end quote. In a February 24 memorandum to Gardner and Helms, Katzenbach cited the narrowness of the mandate in listing problems faced by the committee. 1. The narrow scope of this mandate as compared with the demands by Senator Mansfield et al. That this flap be used as a springboard for a review of all clandestine activities financing a review of all clandestine financing by the CIA. 2. More specifically, the exclusion in this mandate of relationships between CIA and American businesses abroad. 3. Focusing the mandate on CIA rather than on all private organization relationships with government agencies. In testimony before this, Mr. Katzenbach said that his committee was designed by President Johnson not only to deal with the relationship of the CIA to educational and voluntary organizations, but to head off a full-scale congressional investigation. Footnote 7. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 7. Nicholas Katzenbach testimony. October 11th, 75, page 5. Katzenbach also said of the President's decision on membership, quote, he, in brackets, the President, end brackets, wanted John Gardner on it because he thought that it would help politically in getting acceptance of whatever the recommendations turned out to be, because he thought Helms would defend everything and wanted to continue everything. Gardner would want to stop everything. It was my job to come out with something in the middle, end quote. In parentheses, IPID. Resuming the reading. All other covert relationships were to be excluded from the investigation. In a memo to his colleagues, the Deputy Chief of the Covert Action Staff reported, it is stated that the country operations funded by black bag, in brackets, sterilized or laundered funds, end brackets, were not to be included in the CIA's response to the Katzenbach Commission, and emphasized that the focus of this paper was to be on organizations. In addition, the Katzenbach Committee did not undertake investigation of CIA domestic commercial operations, specifically those designed to provide cover for clandestine intelligence operations, which, end of page 189, beginning page 190. The U.S. directed at such targets as foreign students, foreign businessmen, foreign diplomatic and consular officials traveling or residing in the United States. Despite the narrowness of its mandate, the actual investigation of the Katzenbach Committee was vigorous and thorough. After deliberation, the committee issued the basic recommendation that it should be the policy of the United States government that no federal agency shall provide any covert financial assistance or support, direct or indirect, to any of the nation's educational or private voluntary organizations. In May 1967, Deputy Director for Plans Desmond Fitzgerald interpreted the post-Katzenbach ground rules in a circular to the field. He stated, several operational guidelines emerge. A. Covert relations with commercial U.S. organizations are not barred. B. Covert funding overseas of foreign-based international organizations is permitted. He indicated that greater care would be needed in the conduct of clandestine operations in order to prevent disclosures. A. The care required under the Katzenbach report with respect to the recruitment and use of U.S. students and U.S. university professors applies equally to the recruitment and use of foreign students. In simple terms, we are now in a different ball game. Some of the basic ground rules have changed. When in doubt, ask HQs. Section 5. A different ball game. CIA response to Katzenbach. The policy guidelines established in the Katzenbach report and supplemental guidelines with which the CIA interpreted the report brought major adjustments in covert action programs and methods. Some 77 projects were examined at high levels within the CIA, and lists were drawn up of projects to be terminated, projects to be transferred to other sources of funding, projects to continue, and projects whose future required higher level decisions. The 303 Committee met frequently throughout 1967 and 1968 to deal with difficult questions, such as how to provide for continued funding of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. At the same time, the agency was withdrawing from support of a large number of domestically based organizations. It moved rapidly to shelter certain high-priority operations from the Katzenbach prohibitions to devise more secure funding mechanisms. This process was facilitated by what was termed, quote, surge funding, end quote. The Katzenbach guidelines called for termination of CIA funding of domestically based U.S. organizations by December 31st, 1967. With the 303 Committee approval for the largest grants, the agency, quote, surge funded, end quote, a number of organizations, giving them advances before the December deadline, which carried them, in some cases, for up to 2 years of operations. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were so funded. In adjusting to the, quote, new ballgame, end quote, the appearance of contravening the Katzenbach guidelines, rather than specific regulations, was, end of page 190, beginning page 191, seen as a reason not to continue relationships with certain institutions. At the same time, at least one case suggests that even a clean termination of funding with a private organization did not necessarily end the CIA's support of the policies and programs of the organization. The CIA report on termination plans for a large project in the Far East indicated that with surge funding, the organization could continue into fiscal year 1969, and that thereafter, quote, in brackets, the organization's, end brackets, board of trustees will assume full responsibility for the organization and has pledged to continue its policies and range of activities, end quote. The following are examples of the score of projects which the CIA reviewed in 1967 and decided to continue to fund. 1. Publications and Press Institute that mandated a worldwide network of stringers and correspondence. A CIA report on the project asserted that it, quote, exerts virtually no domestic influence in any quarter, although its publications are read by U.S. students, end quote. 2. Several international trade union organizations. 3. Foreign-based news feature service. 4. Foreign-based Research and Publishing Institute. In reviewing the CIA's adjustments to the Katzenbach Committee's recommendations, the committee found no violations of the policy the report sets forth. However, it is important to recognize how narrow the focus of the Katzenbach Committee's concern was. The problem was approached by the committee and by the CIA essentially as one of security, how to limit the damage caused by the revelations of the CIA relationships with private U.S. institutions. Many of the restrictions developed by the CIA in response to the events of 1967 appeared to be security measures aimed at preventing further public disclosure which could jeopardize sensitive CIA operations. They did not represent significant rethinking of where boundaries ought to be drawn in a free society. Moreover, President Johnson adopted the Katzenbach Report as policy. It was not issued as an executive order or enacted as a statute. Thus, it has no firm legal status. Section 6, post-1967, relations with the U.S. academic community. In analyzing the adequacy of the Katzenbach regulations and of the CIA's compliance with them, the Select Committee concentrated much of its attention on contemporary relationships between the CIA and the U.S. academic community. The committee interprets, quote, academic community, end quote, to include more than the Katzenbach Committee undoubtedly had in mind when it recommended prohibition of, quote, covert financial assistance or support to any of the nation's educational organizations, end quote. Quote, academic community, end quote, has been interpreted by this committee to include universities, university-related research centers, and the full range of individual scholars and school administrators, ranging from department heads to career counselors and to PhD candidates engaged in teaching. The committee has approached this inquiry with three principal questions. 1. What is the extent and nature of CIA relationships with U.S. academic institutions and with individual American academics? 2. What are the guidelines and ground rules governing CIA post-Katzenbach relations with the academic community? 3. What issues are at stake? What threats, if any, do current relations pose for the independence of this influential sector of society? End of page 191, beginning page 192. The CIA relationships with the academic community are extensive and serve many purposes, including providing leads and making introductions for intelligence purposes, collaboration in research and analysis, intelligence collection abroad, and preparation of books and other propaganda materials. The Select Committee's concentration has been on the area of clandestine relationships, untouched by the Katzenbach Committee individuals. Section 7. Covert relations with individuals in the academic community. As already noted, from the first days of the Katzenbach Committee, the CIA proceeded on the operating assumption that the inquiry was directed squarely at institutional relationships, not individuals in or affiliated with those private institutions. After the Katzenbach report, the agency instituted a basic instruction entitled, quote, restriction on operational use of certain categories of individuals, end quote. This instruction remains in force today. The instruction states that the, quote, basic rule, end quote, for use of human agents by the Operations Directorate is that, quote, any consenting adult, end quote, may be used, while all members of the American academic community, including students, certainly qualify as, quote, consenting adults, end quote. The CIA, since 1967, has been particularly sensitive to the risks associated with their use. In order to control and confine contacts with American academics, the handling of relationships with individuals associated with universities is largely confined to two CIA divisions of Directorate of Operations: the Domestic Collection Division and the Foreign Resources Division. The Domestic Collection Division is the point of contact with large numbers of American academics who travel abroad or who are otherwise consulted on the subject of their expertise. The Foreign Resources Division, on the other hand, is the purely operational arm of the CIA in dealing with American academics. Altogether, DCD and FRD are currently in contact, ranging from the occasional debriefing to a continuing operational relationship with many thousands of United States academics at hundreds of U.S. academic institutions. It is imperative to underline that the majority of these relationships are purely for the purpose of asking an academic about his travels abroad or open, informal consulting on subjects of the academic's expertise. The committee sees no danger to the integrity of American private institutions in continuing such contacts. Indeed, there are benefits to both the government and the universities in such contacts. The CIA's Office of Personnel also maintains relationships with university administrators, sometimes in the placement office. These relationships, which are usually contractual, enable the CIA to approach suitable United States students for CIA employment. The, quote, operational use, end quote, of academics is another matter. It raises troubling questions as to preservation of the integrity of American academic institutions. Section 8. Covert use of the U.S. academic community. The Central Intelligence Agency is now using several hundred American academics. Footnote 11. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 11. Quote, academics, end quote, includes administrators, faculty members, and graduate students engaged in teaching. Resuming the reading. Who in addition to providing leads and on. End of page 192, beginning page 193. Occasion, making introductions for intelligence purposes, occasionally write books and other material to be used for propaganda purposes abroad. Beyond these, an additional few score are used in an unwitting manner for minor activities. These academics are located in 100 American colleges, universities, and related institutes. At the majority of institutes, no one other than the individual is concerned, other than the individual concerned is aware of the CIA link. At the others, at least one university official is aware of the operational use made of academics on his campus. In addition, there are several American academics abroad who serve operational purposes, primarily the collection of intelligence. Footnote 12. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 12. For explanation of italics, see footnote, page 179. Resuming the reading. The CIA considers these operational relationships with the United States academic community as perhaps its most sensitive domestic area and has strict controls governing these operations. According to the agency's internal directives, the following distinctions govern the operational use of individuals. The CIA's directives prohibit the operational use of individuals who are receiving support under the Mutual Education and Cultural Exchange Act of 1961, commonly known as the Fulbright-Hays Act. Falling under this particular prohibition are teachers, research scholars, lecturers, and students who have been selected to receive scholarships or grants by the Board of Foreign Scholarships. This prohibition specifically does not apply to several other categories of grantees supported by other provisions of the Fulbright-Hays Act, such as artists, athletes, leaders, specialists, or participants in international trade fairs or expositions, who do not come under the aegis of the President's Board of Foreign Scholarships. As far as the three major foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, are concerned, the prohibition extends to, quote, persons actively participating in programs who are wholly sponsored and controlled by any of these foundations. Additionally, there will be no operational use made of the officials or employees of these organizations, end quote. These large foundations were cited by a CIA official in 1966 before the 303 Committee as, quote, a trouble area in New York City, reluctant to cooperate on joint ventures, end quote. Section 9. Covert relationships with academic and voluntary organizations. Conclusions. With respect to CIA covert relationships with private institutions and voluntary organizations, the committee concludes, 1. The CIA has adhered to the 1967 Katzenbach governing relationship with domestic, private, and voluntary institutions. The guidelines are so narrowly focused, however, that the covert use of American individuals from these institutions has continued. 2. American academics are now being used for such operational purposes as making introductions for intelligence purposes. Footnote 12a. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 12a. For explanation of italics, see footnote page 179. Resuming the reading. And working for the agency abroad. Although the numbers are not as great today as in 1966, there are no prohibitions to prevent an increase in the operational use of academics. The size of these operations is determined by the CIA. 3. With the exception of those teachers, scholars, and students who receive scholarships or grants from the Board of Foreign Scholarships. End of page 193, beginning page 194. The CIA is not prohibited from the operational use of all other categories of grantee support under the Fulbright-Hays Act. Artists, leaders, athletes, specialists, etc. Nor is there any prohibition on the operational use of individuals participating in any other exchange program funded by the United States government. In addressing the issues of the CIA's relationship to the American academic community, and the committee is keenly aware that if the CIA is to serve the intelligence needs of the nation, it must have unfettered access to the best advice and judgment our universities can produce. But this advice and expertise can and should be openly sought and openly given. Suspicion that such openness of intellectual counter and exchange is complemented by covert operational exploitation of academics and students can only prejudice, if not destroy, the possibility of a full and fruitful exchange between the nation's best minds and the nation's most critical intelligence needs. To put these intellects in the service of the nation Trust and confidence must be maintained between our intelligence agencies and the academic community. The committee is disturbed by the present practice of operationally using American academics and by the awareness that the restraints on expanding this practice are primarily those of sensitivity to the risks of disclosure and not an appreciation of dangers to the integrity of individuals and institutions. Nevertheless, the committee does not recommend a legislative prohibition on the operational exploitation of individuals in private institutions by the intelligence agencies. The committee views such legislation as both unenforceable and in itself an intrusion on the privacy and integrity of American academic community. The committee believes that it is the responsibility of private institutions, and particularly the American academic community, to set the professional and ethical standards of its members. This report on the nature and extent of covert individual relations with the CIA is intended to alert these institutions that there is a problem. At the same time, the committee recommends that the CIA amend its internal directives that individual and academic One moment. At the same time, the committee recommends that the CIA amend its internal directives to require that individual academics used for operational purposes by the CIA, together with the president or equivalent officials of the relevant academic institutions, be informed of the clandestine CIA relationship. The committee also feels strongly that there should be no operational use made of professors, lecturers, students, artists, and the like, who are funded under United States government-sponsored programs. The prohibition on the operational use of Fulbright grantees must be extended to other government-sponsored programs, and in this case, the prohibition should be confirmed by law, given the direct responsibility of the Congress for these programs. It is unacceptable that Americans would go overseas under a cultural or academic exchange program funded openly by the United States Congress, and at the same time serve an operational purpose directed by the Central Intelligence Agency. Section B. Covert relationships with the United States media. In pursuing its foreign intelligence mission, the Central Intelligence Agency has used the United States media for both collection of intelligence, end of page 194, beginning page 195, and for cover, until February 1976, when it was announced a new policy toward U.S. media personnel. The CIA maintained covert relationships with about 50 American journalists or employees of U.S. media organizations. They are part of a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempt to influence foreign opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of foreign newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets. Footnote 13. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 13. For explanation of footnotes, see page 179. Resuming the reading. The CIA has been particularly sensitive to the change that CIA covert relationships with the American media jeopardize the credibility of the American press and risk the possibility of propagandizing the U.S. public. Former Director William Colby expressed this concern in recent testimony before the House Select Committee on Intelligence. We have taken particular caution to ensure that our operations are focused abroad and not at the United States in order to influence the opinion of the American people about things from a CIA point of view. As early as 1967, the CIA, in the wake of the National Student Association disclosure, moved to flatly prohibit the publication of books, magazines, or newspapers in the United States. More recently, George Bush, the new director, undertook as one of his first actions to recognize the, quote, special status afforded the American media under our Constitution, end quote, and therefore pledged that, quote, CIA will not enter into any paid or contractual relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any United States news service, newspaper, periodical, radio or television network, or station, end quote. Footnote 14. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 14. George Bush statement, February 11th, 76. Resuming the reading. In approaching the subject of the CIA's relationship with the United States media, the Select Committee has been guided by several broad concerns. It has inquired into the covert publication of propaganda in order to assess its domestic impact. It has investigated the nature and purpose of the covert relationships that the CIA maintains with the bona fide U.S. journalists. It has examined the use of journalistic, quote, cover, end quote, by CIA agents. It has pursued the difficult issue of domestic, quote, fallout, end quote, from CIA's foreign press placements and other propaganda activities. Throughout, it has comparted current practice to the regulations restricting activities in this area, in order both to establish whether the CIA has complied with existing regulations and, more important, in order to evaluate the adequacy of the regulations themselves. Section 1. Books and Publishing Houses. Covert propaganda is the hidden exercise of the power of persuasion. In a world of covert propaganda, book publishing activities have a special place. In 1961, the chief of the CIA's Covert Action, end of page 195, beginning page 196, staff, who had responsibility for the covert propaganda program, wrote, "Books differ from all other propaganda media, primarily because one single book can significantly change the reader's attitude and action to an extent unmatched by the impact of any other single medium. This, of course, not true of all books at times and with all readers, but it is true significantly often enough to make books the most important weapon of strategic, long-range propaganda." According to the Chief of Covert Action Staff, the CIA's clandestine handling of book publishing and distribution could a. Get books published or distributed abroad without revealing any U.S. influence by covertly subsidizing foreign publications or booksellers. B. Get books published which should not be, quote, contaminated, end quote, by any overt tie-in with U.S. government, especially if the position of the author is, quote, delicate, end quote. C. Get books published for operational reasons, regardless of commercial viability. D. Initiate and subsidize indigenous, national, or international organizations for book publishing or distributing purposes. E. Stimulate the writing of politically significant books by unknown foreign authors, either by directly subsidizing the author if covert contact is feasible, or indirectly through literary agents or publishers. Well over 1,000 books were produced, subsidized, or sponsored by the CIA before the end of 1967. Approximately 25 of them were written in English. Approximately 25% of them were written in English. Many of them were published by cultural organizations which the CIA backed, and more often than not, the author was unaware of CIA subsidization. Some books, however, involved direct collaboration between the CIA and the writer. The chief of the agency's propaganda unit wrote in 1961, "The advantage of our direct contact with the author is that we can acquaint him in great detail with our intentions, that we can provide him with whatever material we want him to include, and that we can check the manuscript at every stage. Our control over the writer will have to be enforced usually by paying him for the time he works on the manuscript, or at least advocating him sums which he might have to repay. In brackets, the agency, in brackets, must make sure the actual manuscript will correspond with our operational and propagandistic intention." The committee has reviewed a few examples of what the chief of the Covert Action Staff termed, quote, "books published for operational reasons regardless of commercial viability," end quote. Examples included 1. A book about the conflict in Indochina was produced in 1954 at the initiation of the CIA's Far East Divisions. A major U.S. publishing house under contract to the CIA published the book in French and English. Copies of both editions were distributed to foreign embassies. End of page 196, beginning page 197. In the United States, and to select newspapers and magazine editors, both in the United States and abroad. 2. A book about a student from a developing country who had studied in a communist country, quote, was developed by, in brackets, 2 area divisions of the CIA, end brackets, and produced by the Domestic Operations Division, and has had a high impact in the U.S. as well as the, in brackets, foreign area, in brackets, market, end quote. The book, which was published by the European outlet of a U.S. publishing house, was published in condensed form in 2 major U.S. magazines. Eric Sevareid, the CBS political commentator, in reviewing this book, spoke a larger truth than he knew when he suggested that, quote, "our propaganda services could do worse than to flood," brackets, foreign, in brackets, university towns with this volume, end quote. 3. Another CIA book, the Penkovsky Papers, was published in the United States in 1965, quote, "for operational reasons," end quote, but actually became commercially viable. The book was prepared and written by Whiting Agency Assets, who drew on actual case materials. Publication rights to the manuscript were sold to a publisher through a trust fund, which was established for the purpose. The publisher was unaware of any U.S. government interest. And I'm going to stop here for today's recording.